The Meaning of Marxism by Paul D'Amato. Section: The Crisis of Overproduction. The unplanned, explosive growth that takes place under capitalism does not happen smoothly. It is accompanied by periodic crises that lead to mass bankruptcies and unemployment. From Marx's day to the present, the system has been prone to sudden periods in which growth gives way to stagnation and even decline. Economic crises that put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on trial, each time more threateningly. These crises, absurdly, are not caused by shortages like a crop failure or some other disaster. They are crises of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism, wrote Marx and Engels in the Manifesto. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. End quote. Economic crises underline the fact that in our society, production is not for human need, but for profit. Crises happen because capitalists can't sell their goods profitably, not because there aren't millions who could use the, quote, overproduced goods. 800 million people go hungry every year. Yet economists can speak of a grain glut or a pork glut. Steel is used to make so many essential products that literally hundreds of millions of people desperately need, yet the financial press can talk of a steel glut. Millions can be homeless, yet there can be real talk of a real estate glut. Supply and demand under capitalism have nothing to do with human need. In India, for example, 200 million people are malnourished. Yet in 1995, India exported $625 million worth of wheat and $1.3 billion worth of rice, a total of 5 million metric tons. Profit alone, quote, determines the expansion or contraction of production, instead of the proportion between production and social needs, the needs of socially developed human beings. Production comes to a standstill, not at the point where needs are satisfied, but rather where the production and realization of profit impose this. End quote. Workers are reminded of this dynamic with each new crisis of overproduction, such as the laid-off workers at Enron in 2001, who were driven away from the front of company headquarters in Houston by mounted police. However, capitalism is actually a system of constant underproduction insofar as it fails to meet the basic needs of millions of people. There cannot seriously be any talk of overproduction so long as the needs of the majority are not properly met. A rational system based upon planned production would make use of the tremendous advances we have made in science and technology to first ensure that food, shelter, clothing, and adequate transportation were provided for all. As long as people need such things, there cannot be, in rational terms, overproduction. But capitalism is anything but rational from that standpoint. What causes these crises? Capitalist crises arise from the unplanned nature of the system. Overproduction of commodities is a regular feature of a system in which production and distribution are regulated not by a plan, but blindly through the market. Because individual capitalists or corporations produce without knowing in advance what they can sell, and moreover, because they strive to expand production and capture more market share, there is a built-in tendency for capitalists, quote, to produce without regard to the limits of the market. Crisis, that is, a disruption in the process of production and circulation, takes place in the same way that trains become held up, one behind the other, if there are too many launched on the same line. In fact, it is only through crisis, ultimately, that the system is able to restore some balance in the economy. One is a condition of the other. This is not how mainstream economists see it. In flush times, bourgeois economists offer upbeat forecasts of endless prosperity ahead. Quote, American industry and business have reached that status of well-being, wrote one economist not long before the Wall Street crash in 1929, where it no longer has to fear a recurrence of the radical spreads from prosperity to depression that formerly afflicted business and industry. Similarly, effervescent claims were made during the Clinton boom of the 1990s. The big bad business cycle has been tamed, proclaimed the Wall Street Journal in 1996. But during the 1990s, boom did give way to bust, starting with a group of Asian economies and then spreading worldwide. In the first half of the decade, billions of dollars in investment flowed into the Asian tiger economies, fueling a boom in export-led growth that led economists to declare an Asian miracle. But when exports slumped, these countries, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines, found themselves unable to repay massive loans extended to them by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and other institutions. Money they had borrowed on the assumption that sales would continue to grow. Then, in 1997, noted the Financial Times, came the panic. The net inflow turned into an estimated outflow of $12 billion. The swing in the net supply of private capital was $105 billion in just 1 year, a staggering 10% of the combined pre-crisis gross domestic product of the 5 countries. Indonesia was devastated by waves of bankruptcies, and 20 million people were tossed out of their jobs, in a country that was already suffering from a staggering 38% unemployment rate. The Asian crisis then spread globally, to Russia, Latin America, and the United States. According to Joel Geyer, world trade declined for the first time since the Second World War. And in the United States, 3 million manufacturing jobs were wiped out. Quote, in no other recession since the 1930s had there been so many on such massive corporate bankruptcies. Global Crossing, Enron, Conseco, WorldCom, Bethlehem Steel, United Airlines, Roadway, Budget Rent-A-Car, Kmart, and Montgomery Ward, among others. Typically, economists failed to predict the crisis. One of the more serious economic commentators, Paul Krugman, explained to an audience of bankers in Hong Kong, quote, I was 90% wrong about what was going to happen in Asia. However, everyone else was 150% wrong. They saw only the miracle and none of the risks. End quote. This wishing away of crisis goes back to the 18th and early 19th century economists like J.B. Say and James Mill, who said that supply creates its own demand. There can be no, quote, superfluity of commodities, argued Mill, because everything that is produced will find a buyer. Marx was scornful of this idea. Nothing can be more childish, wrote Karl Marx in Capital, than the dogma that, because every sale is a purchase and every purchase a sale, therefore the circulation of commodities necessarily implies an equilibrium of sale and purchase. It may be a comforting idea, but it hardly accords with reality, where economic crisis, at its core, consists precisely in the rupture between purchase and sale. The cycle of boom and bust begins with an upswing or boom, periods of unrestrained growth in which the capital investments in new technology and labor spur growth. More and more workers are hired, more and more goods are sold, and more profits are raked in. Capitalism's periodic crisis of every 10 years or so is in part caused by the system's tendency towards this hyped-up, unplanned growth. But like a partygoer who has had too much fun, there's always the inevitable crash, hangover, and morning blues. Business is always thoroughly set and the campaign in fullest swing until the sudden intervention of the collapse, wrote Marx. As capitalism reaches the height of its boom phase, prices and wages start to go up in response to the increasing demand for labor and goods. Hungry for profits, capitalists borrow huge sums of money from banks and other lenders in order to get in on the profit bonanza, thereby taking on huge debts that they expect to pay off from windfall profits. Debt, in other words, helps prolong the boom by offering cheap money to investors. But it sets them up for bigger falls once the crisis hits, because it creates an intricate financial chain that, if broken, threatens a financial crisis. As the Polish-born Marxist Rosa Luxemburg wrote in her famous book, Reform or Revolution, quote, "When the inner tendency of capitalist production to extend boundlessly strikes against the restricted dimensions of private property, credit appears as a means of surmounting these limits in a particular capitalist manner." End quote. Yet credit does so by extending production beyond the limits of the market, that is, beyond the point at which goods can be sold profitably. In addition, credit allows for more extensive market speculation, buying and selling based on price fluctuations. Credit ties capitalist investors together in a web of relations, so that when some capitalists go bankrupt, it threatens the whole health of the system. Credit, wrote Rosa Luxemburg, instead of being an instrument for the suppression or the attenuation of crises, is, on the contrary, a particularly mighty instrument for the formation of crises. As increasing costs eat into profits, and capitalists begin to worry about their profit rates, they begin to cut back on investments, producing first a crisis in what Marx called Department 1, the department that makes the means of production, producer goods. Workers are then laid off in this sector, which restricts consumption and begins to produce a slump in sales in Department 2, the production of the means of consumption, consumer goods. Banks and other lenders begin calling in loans and refusing to grant new loans, which leads to bankruptcies, more layoffs, more slumps in sales, and so on in a vicious downward spiral. Crises can be mild or harsh, producing either stagnation or decline in production, negative growth, for a shorter or longer period. But they always lead to mass layoffs, and therefore increased misery for the working class and the poor. How are the relations corresponding to a healthy movement of capitalist production to be restored? Marx asked. Growth can only be restored after a certain amount of capital is destroyed, or drastically devalued, and profit rates restored. This happens in a number of ways. First, unemployment brought on by the crisis allows employers to drastically lower wages without fear of retaliation. Second, the machinery and physical plant of bankrupt businesses is either destroyed or devalued. Some of the oldest, least productive plant and equipment are simply tossed on the scrap heap. The rest can still be operated, but not profitably by their owners, whose investments can't be recouped because prices are too low. The capitalists that have survived the crisis best now swoop in and buy up on the cheap the unprofitable or bankrupt businesses. The cheaper capital and wage costs mean that the remaining capitalists can once again begin to operate profitably. Then the whole cycle begins again. Each economic crisis accelerates the centralization and concentration of capital, the big fish eating the small fish, or the profitable fish eating the bankrupt fish. State intervention can, of course, sometimes alter the character or the impact of the boom-bust cycle. For example, states can manipulate the supply of money or try to influence interest rates in order to make it easier or harder for capitalists to get loans. But these manipulations, because they attack the symptoms rather than the causes, cannot eliminate crises. End of section.